Hello, handsome. How do you feel about cross-dressing? Well, actually, I think I'm getting ahead of myself. Have you ever been interested in punk rock or where that movement came from? If you have, then I have some great news for you. This video is part 1 in a series on the history of punk rock and all of the subgenres that branched off of it. I want to shout out one of my subscribers in particular, Shouting Mutinous, who suggested this video, and I'll be following it up with a part 2 right after. I'm also going to include in the description down below a playlist of all the songs played in this video, so if you want to check that out, you'll be able to. Leave a like if you dig the video, and let's get started. So first things first, I want to go ahead and give a brief synopsis of what punk rock is for those who have a limited understanding of it. Punk rock is an aggressive and simplistic form of rock music that's peak only lasted for about 5 years in the 1970s. Some of the notable artists in this era were the Sex Pistols, the Ramones, and Patti Smith. After those 5 years, it quickly evolved and turned into other subgenres. However, it remained prominent in the underground. Punk rock gained popularity not only for its music, but also because of its aesthetic and its ideology of anti-commercialism, teenage angst, and rebellion. That is a very basic summary of what punk is, and we will touch on it further in part 2, but that's not what this video is about. Most historians point to 1975 to 1976 as the year that punk took shape. So what came before that? Proto-punk is a term to describe the bands that came around before 1975 that heavily influenced the punk rock movement. Bands are usually put into this category for their music, but they could also be influential because of their stage presence or even their fashion. It's important to note that proto-punk was never a movement by itself, and a lot of these bands were labeled this after punk rock had had its peak. Some of these artists really blur the line between proto-punk and punk as well, although it really comes down to when they were prominent. So now we have to ask, when did this all start and what bands were considered the most influential under the proto-punk label? As with all things rock, we can talk about the tremendous influence that blues had on punk, but I want to fast forward a little bit to get to the 1960s. I want to go ahead and talk about the rock influences specifically and the bands that are considered proto-punk. We can really start by tracing this back to the mid-1960s with the British invasion, which is when a lot of those British rock bands were becoming really popular in the States. A lot of these early rock bands took blues music and put a sharper edge to it that appealed to a lot of younger audiences. There were some real staples in this era that would go on to influence a lot of the earlier punk bands. In 1964, we got the blues-inspired, power chord heavy You Really Got Me by the Kinks. And then going into 1965, the Rolling Stones would release their hit song that was both anti-commercialism and sexually suggestive with I Can't Get No Satisfaction. In the same year, The Who would drop their song that would just drip with teenage angst and aggression with My Generation. The use of distorted amplifiers, power chords, and shouting vocals can be found in a lot of the bands that came after these ones. These songs would showcase where rock was heading and would define a new generation. And then on the American side, there were a lot of bands that helped pave the way for the punk rock that was to come. There was a genre in the 60s called garage rock that was caused by a lot of young people being inspired by a lot of the British invasion bands and also a lot of the surf rock coming out at the time. They made music mostly in their garages, hence the name. This genre would peak in the 1960s and had some songs and bands that were popular and helped push the envelope even more than their British contemporaries. Bands like the Sonics, the 13th Floor Elevators, and MC5 were pioneers in the underground. The Sonics were straight-ahead rock and roll and were raw and aggressive sounding, and their song The Witch would become a staple in the rock catalog. She's an evil she's the witch. The 13th Floor Elevators were pioneers in psychedelic rock, but had a more unpolished edge to them. Their debut album is still considered innovative even by today's standards. MC5 were an incredibly influential hard rock band and are still considered heavy today. Their song Kick Out the Jams is a staple in the punk rock canon. Kick out the jams, motherfucker! On top of these classics, the Velvet Underground's album White Light, White Heat would prove to be incredibly influential to the punk rock movement due to its experimental songwriting, provocative lyrics, and raw production. There's a lot of cross-pollination in the 1960s with psychedelic rock, garage rock, and more experimental music, and that's why people don't really label proto-punk as a cohesive movement with a straight through line like other genres. It's a pretty loose label to apply to a diverse range of bands. But that was the 1960s, so now we need to ask, what happened in the early 1970s that would be so influential that it would spur the movement known as punk rock in the late 70s? So to talk about proto-punk in the early 1970s, we have to talk about one man and one band in particular, Iggy Pop and his band, The Stooges. They had only released 3 albums in the prominent part of their career, which was The Stooges in 1969, Funhouse in 1970, and Raw Power in 1973. The Stooges were started outside of Detroit in the late 1960s and had all of the classic elements of an early punk band and music that would provoke the public. Their music used lots of distortion and had a heaviness that was unheard of at the time. Iggy Pop is often credited as the godfather of punk for his explosive vocal delivery, his ferocious onstage presence, and his legendary offstage life. He has this signature snarl to his voice and would rotate between screeching, screaming, and spoken word. I'm a streetwalking cheetah with a hat full of napalm. Iggy was also known to cut himself on stage and also walk across this sea of people as he was singing. His stage presence was unlike anything else at the time and would be something outside of his music that would also inspire a lot of the bands that came after him. The band only lasted a few short years, however, Iggy Pop would go on to work with David Bowie and have his own solo career. Iggy Pop is easily one of the most important people in punk rock's history. However, there were a couple other releases in the 1970s that helped set the stage for what was to come. In 1972, Elektra Records asked one of its talent scouts, Lenny Kaye, to put together a compilation album of different songs. Lenny also worked as a rock writer, but also a record store clerk, so he was pretty up to speed on the gems that were coming in and out of the music scene. The compilation album that he put together was called Nuggets, Original Artifacts from the First Psychedelic Era, 1965 to 1968. On that album was tons of psychedelic music, but also a lot of garage rock that may have flown under the radar up until then. The reason that we're talking about this album is because it is one of the most influential albums for the punk rock scene that was to come about later. Here was an entire 27-track compilation full of lesser-known garage rock and psychedelic rock bands that may not have been known at this point unless it was for Nuggets. Not only that, but the liner notes in the album that were written by Lenny were one of the first times that somebody had used the term punk rock. And Lenny Kaye's influence wouldn't stop there. He would go on to become the guitarist for Patti Smith, who we will absolutely be talking about soon. And now, we finally get to talk about cross-dressing. 1973 saw the release of the debut album of one of the hottest New York City bands at the time, the New York Dolls. New York Dolls were one of the dirtiest and most confrontational bands at the time, and everyone from David Bowie to Lou Reed would come by to see their shows. They would draw crowds not only because of their music, but also because they dressed in women's clothing and put on a great show. They had an attitude that rock had become too full of itself, so they wanted to strip everything back and just play short, raunchy songs. They only released a couple albums in the 1970s, however, their legacy would go on long after they disbanded. New York Dolls' philosophy and music would go on to influence their successors, but their fashion choices also played a huge part in the punk rock movement. Plus, that first album really is one of the most fun and catchy albums of the 1970s. So now the stage is set. Everything has been bubbling under the surface for 10 years, and the underground is about to make itself prominent to the public. The sensation known as punk rock is about to erupt in the 1970s. Punk rock is one of the most influential music genres of all time, and I can't wait to cover it with you. I will be covering it in the follow-up to this video, but I really hope you enjoyed this one. Be sure to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this one, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.